What is going on, guys? Well, with the release of Oppenheimer this weekend and the Barbenheimer phenomenon that took over the theaters, we now have 12 films by Christopher Nolan. One of, if not the most celebrated director working today. One of those guys that sells tickets just because he is the one making the film. And there's not too many directors that have that power. So, I've always been a massive Christopher Nolan fan. There's certainly some movies that he has made that aren't quite my cup of tea for a variety of reasons. And because of that, this is absolutely a list of my preferences. There's not a single bad movie on this list. Most of the movies on this list I would give an overwhelmingly positive review for. But when it comes to rankings, it's personal preference, it's which ones I'm going to rewatch the most, it's which ones that mean the most to me, and that is the beauty of being a movie fan. So let me know your personal preference list down in the comment section below. And with that being said, we will waste no time whatsoever and immediately get into the 12th film, my least favorite movie directed by Christopher Nolan, and that's going to be Dunkirk. Now, this is a bit of an unpopular placement, but I'm not really a war movie guy. There are certain war movies that I absolutely adore. Patriot, Braveheart, you got Hacksaw Ridge most recently that I loved, a couple others, but for the most part, the war genre is not necessarily a group of films that I go to very often, and they are certainly one of the least rewatched type of films. And when you have Dunkirk and you have a guy like Christopher Nolan that is pretty much known for always doing something different, putting a twist into what otherwise would be a very straightforward movie, the twist in Dunkirk is that essentially he's just trying to give you the experience of this war while not necessarily honing in on a specific character or an overall narrative or character arc. It's just a bunch of people in this situation trying to survive, and you get to see different viewpoints of different time periods all going on at once in this battle. And that's where the movie leaves me. That's where the movie loses my interest, because as much as I can commend the attempt there, and for some people it absolutely works, the only war movies that I find myself really being fond of, and especially ones that I rewatch, are ones with really strong characters and especially a strong narrative. And that's just not the intention with this movie. That was never the focus of Christopher Nolan. So I've tried to watch it a number of times, and it just doesn't work for me. Coming in barely above that is number 11, and that is Following. And this is a film that I think most people would probably put at the bottom just because it is the most raw of any of his films. It's basically like a student film that's feature length. You know, this was where you could see a lot of Christopher Nolan's early promise. You could get a little flavor of the Nolanisms that were going to take over his filmography and be these signature things that his career is known for. But it's absolutely a low budget effort. And so to a certain extent, Dunkirk probably deserves to be above this just because of the grand scale and spectacle that he's going for, but I would rather re-experience the story of Following before Dunkirk. And essentially you've got a guy that goes off and he breaks into people's houses, doesn't steal anything, but he does something to alter their lives. And this guy kind of gets caught up and infatuated with it and joins in. And it's kind of more along the lines of like a Memento type movie from Christopher Nolan. And it's interesting. You know, you certainly see limitations there, but at the same time, it's also commendable that Christopher Nolan was able to get a movie made of this quality for the amount of money and people he had working with him to get it done. So to me, that makes me appreciate it just barely more. But for as commendable as it is, stacked against all of the wildly unique and interesting films that Christopher Nolan has done since Following, this movie is literally bringing a toothpick to a gunfight. Coming in at number 10 is going to be Tenet. Now, this is a movie that I went back and forth on quite a bit when I first saw it. When I first saw it in theaters, I didn't really enjoy it all that much. I appreciated a lot of things about it, but it was just way too complicated and convoluted for me. Even just the basic espionage plot was convoluted before you even got to the time displacement stuff. Cool to look at, certainly mind-boggling and impressive on how they were able to shoot and edit some of those scenes and make it look so awesome, but in a narrative stance, it just didn't do a whole lot for me. And then I rewatched the film and I was like, hey, you know, I liked it better. It's a 4 out of 5. And then I want to smack myself for ever saying that, because I have never had the desire to revisit this film ever since. And when I watched it for this re-ranking, again, it just doesn't really do a whole lot for me. It, on paper, should be one of my favorites because I love a good spy espionage film, especially one that is different than your kind of more tropey approaches. I love time travel. You mix those two things together and you have the action set pieces that Christopher Nolan is so awesome at bringing. This should be like a 5 out of 5 movie for me, but I just find that to be way overly complicated, way too convoluted. One of those times where Christopher Nolan shoots for the stars and just does not reach them for me. Always commend the dude for shooting for the stars, for having just gigantic ambition, but there's a few times in his filmography where I don't feel like he comes close to reaching what he is grasping for. This is one of those times. Coming in at number 9 is gonna be Oppenheimer. Now, I said in my review, on a technical stance, this movie might be the best film that Nolan has done. Like, as far as cinematography, filmmaking, directing actors, the editing, the score, everything put together on the technical side of filmmaking, this is an immaculately made film, with the exception of a few audio issues, but we'll get into there.
I can't hear you!
But, subject matter-wise, this is one of the least interesting subjects that he has tackled so far for me personally. I'm not really a big history buff, hence why I'm not really a big war movie guy. You get into quantum physics and all that stuff, it's a little too out there to get my interest. I love science. I love science fiction especially. Quantum stuff, not really my thing either. And then there's a big chunk of this movie that's basically like a courtroom drama as well. And that's another genre that I'm very picky with. So while I can absolutely marvel at some of the things that Nolan was able to do as a filmmaker, while I think that everybody in this massive stacked cast did an incredible job, while I think that the message that the movie tries to leave you with regarding the threat of nuclear weapons and really diving into the head of the character Oppenheimer and his ambition and then his regret later on, all of that was done very well. This is just not a movie that I would ever rewatch. So there's movies above this that I don't think are quite as well made as Oppenheimer, but I would rewatch those before I would this one. The biggest issue with this film, though, was the audio mix. And having a few too many characters and not enough time to spend with them to really grasp their relationship with Oppenheimer. And, you know, it's weird. It's one of those things where ever since Dark Knight Rises, you get some people that say the audio is weird and they can't hear things, and you get some people that swear that it's perfect. So I don't know what the hell Nolan does with his audio mix to where some theaters it works and some theaters it doesn't, but unfortunately, I drew the short straw and I got a theater where about 30% of the dialogue was just indistinguishable. Coming in at number 8 is going to be The Dark Knight Rises. Now remember what I said about rewatch value, because that's really the only reason why this tops Oppenheimer and maybe even tops Tenet, because The Dark Knight Rises, while I'm a Batman whore, and I genuinely love the Dark Knight trilogy, and I think that there are so many elements to this movie that are a very satisfying closing to that trilogy, to the point where I never want them to do any multiverse bullshit with anybody in this universe, and I don't think they ever will be allowed to, because I love as perfect of an ending of a trilogy as you can get, and I think this movie succeeds more than it fails. However, this is by far the sloppiest movie that Nolan has ever done. This is by far the sloppiest script that he has ever done. And there are so many contrivances in this movie that it almost feels like somebody else made it, because Christopher Nolan typically has a very tight narrative to where, especially when he goes for these larger than life concepts that are just way out there, he tends to really go overboard about making sure that everything pulls together tightly and there's not really these significant holes that just makes the whole thing fall apart. And there's a number of them in The Dark Knight Rises. You got a magic little knee brace that makes Bruce Wayne able to walk around and like stomp through concrete walls. He gets his back broken and he's healed because a dude punches him in the spine and then lets him hang for a few days. You get him just randomly appearing back in Gotham, and you just wonder, like, how the fuck did you get back there so quickly? And I need some more answers. That's not good enough for me. There's a few others in here. I mean, even just some simpler ones, like a child being able to get out of that pit when grown-ass men can't get it. Just things like that where you're like, no, too far. But I love Bale as Batman. I love Tom Hardy's Bane. I love Catwoman, Anne Hathaway's Catwoman in here. I think that there is a really nice theme of pain that is done really well narratively here. I think that there are so many things that come back from Batman Begins that makes this a really good complete trilogy. There's some really damn good action sequences in this one, and that's a criticism I've hailed at most of the Nolan trilogy. This one certainly has the best action, the best fighting in my mind. And there's some really standout character moments in this one that are some of my favorites of this entire trilogy. So it's very frustrating. It's one of the more frustrating movies that he has made so far because I want to just say how amazing and perfect it is when I just can't. But it is certainly a movie that I can rewatch and do my best to ignore a lot of those contrivances. And I'm usually fairly successful. Number 7 is gonna be Memento. Now, the first maybe 2-3 times that I watched this film, this would probably be a number of spots higher because I just love the concept. I love the story here and the way that Nolan decides to tell it, breaking it up and telling it backwards to really, literally put you into the mindset of the main character that just doesn't know what is going on throughout the entire story. Just one of the better utilizations I've seen of kind of a narrative trick to quite literally put you into the shoes of the main character, and he does it brilliantly. I love the cast here with Guy Pearce and Joe Pantoliano and all the different character actors that show up throughout it. And the overall mystery is one that is so satisfying because I think it's arranged in a way where you could probably never figure it out the first time that you watch it. It's not one of those twists that you see the breadcrumbs and people that watch a lot of movies can figure it out. I mean, it's a narrative that quite literally you don't figure out what the point of the movie is until the final 5-10 minutes there. So in that way, I think it's a brilliant piece of storytelling and certainly one of the more small scale examples of Christopher Nolan's brilliance. However, it is one of those movies where once you've solved the puzzle, once you've seen behind the curtain, I don't think that the rewatch value is nearly as high as some of the others. So it's a movie that, as much as I love it and as much as I absolutely adored it the first 2 or 3 times that I watched it and wanted everybody that has never heard of it to watch it, it's not really one of his movies that I reach for very often because once I started, I'm like, yeah, I almost get a little impatient because I know all the reveals that are coming and that narrative structure isn't built for rewatch, in my opinion. Number 6 is going to be Interstellar, by a landslide, the most emotional film that Christopher Nolan has ever done. A guy that is constantly accused from a lot of people of being an emotionless storyteller. And there's some movies where I can agree with that criticism, but as a blanket statement for his career, I think it's asinine. And this is the movie that's your best example of just proving that wrong. A story here that boils down to a father's sacrifice. And when you actually are a parent and are a father, it just hits so damn hard. Just the concept of having to leave your children behind to save their life and the rest of humanity, but mostly save your kid's life. That's his main goal. And having the science fiction concept of this difference in time with planets, and so you'll land on one and 20 minutes there is like 10 years back on Earth. And that scene where Matthew McConaughey, they fuck up on a planet and he gets back and he realizes that he's lost like 2 or 3 decades with his kids, and he just has this montage of videos of both of his kids just putting videos out there with no response, not even knowing if he's even looking at them, if he's alive or anything, and him just breaking down. Like, I get teary-eyed just thinking about it right now. Whew, pull yourself together. But I love good science fiction. And this movie is one of the more brilliant concepts for science fiction and space exploration. And it's not really time travel, but messing with time a bit, which is just a really great element that I'm always really sucked into. Some nice twists in there regarding Matt Damon's character that come out of nowhere. A great cast beyond him. I mean, this was Oscar era Matthew McConaughey. Again, Anne Hathaway coming back and great here. Even the adult versions of his kids, Casey Affleck, Jessica Chastain, they do an incredible job. Unfortunately, this movie completely loses me in the last 10 to 15 minutes. As soon as you get to that like alternate dimension bookcase thing, I can't get it. Like, I've watched explain videos, I've read into it. Like, I get what they're going for. It's never like been that hard of a concept to grasp what he's trying to convey there. But it's just so far out there. It's so weird. It's such a leap from already a pretty logically challenging concept throughout the movie that I just can never get there. As soon as we get to that bookcase, like, my enjoyment just goes out the window. If they had landed the plane, if the last 10 to 15 minutes of this movie was on the level of the rest of it, this might be in my top 3. That's how much I love it. But he just completely loses me. As soon as you get to that bookcase, I'm like, fuck, dude. Damn it, you are so close. Coming in at number 5. Do you hear the keyboards breaking? I can hear it from here. The Dark Knight. Now listen, The Dark Knight is awesome. Again, I've said most of the movies on this list, certainly the top half, are 4 out of 5 and above for me. I think I gave 4.5 out of 5 for The Dark Knight when I reviewed it a couple of years ago. This is a great crime thriller. It's a really good Batman movie. It's a great sequel to Batman Begins. Of course, you got just one of the best performances ever out of Heath Ledger as the Joker. I actually think that Aaron Eckhart does almost as good of a job, if not just as good of a job, that always gets overshadowed and never gets talked about as Harvey Dent and Two-Face. I think that Christian Bale, great yet again, and all the other side characters that are here. And this was a movie that was just monumental for comic book films at the time. You had Iron Man and this come out the same year that literally just changed comic book films forever in very different ways. So it's a movie that is always going to be important. It's always going to be celebrated. And I always enjoy it when I rewatch it. The only issues that I actually have with the movie is that I do feel like there's times when Nolan tries to get a little too creative and kind of bogs down the movie a little bit, especially in the third act. The whole thing about Batman having to take the fall for all the people that Two-Face killed, while thematically, I think it's a really rich idea and it's a perfect way to end the story. There's a lot of holes there that I've never been able to wrap my head around about, like, just you can't tell them the Joker killed those people. Like, it just seemed like there was other ways to do it besides Batman having to take the fall and leading into the events of Dark Knight Rises. It never completely worked for me. And this is not necessarily the fault of this movie, because it's not like they knew that Heath Ledger was going to die. And I can almost bet money and body parts that the plan for the eventual third film was for the Joker to come back in some capacity. But the Joker is such a standout character in this that as soon as he is hanging upside down and he leaves the movie, I feel like the air gets let out of the balloon for the movie, and I'm always at that point kind of waiting for it just to be over. It's like the best part of the movie is gone. And that's also another issue, because I'm such a Batman fan. I prefer Batman movies to focus primarily on Batman. And I feel like Batman Begins does that. I feel like The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, Batman is overshadowed by the villains. And so that's always something that frustrates me a little bit too. But beyond that, the main reason why this has slowly just kind of dropped in my reception and my ranking over the years, does anybody else sometimes just hear about a movie and get sucked into conversation about a movie and have a movie just shoved down your throat by the fans so much that it kind of makes you sick of it to a certain extent? Even if it's a movie you love, you're so sick of hearing about it in every conversation that it applies to that you just kind of get burnt out. There's 2 movies that have done that for me since I've been on YouTube. There's John Carpenter's Halloween, and there's The Dark Knight. There have been so many incredible comic book films since 2008 that I feel like the conversation of what is the best or what is your favorite comic book film of all time is a really hard conversation to have. And there is a group of people that as soon as you start asking that question, it's almost like they shut everybody up and they cover your mouth and they scream The Dark Knight in your face. It's like, nothing has ever come anywhere close to The Dark Knight. I just don't agree with that. If that's your favorite, that's fine. We all have our preferences, but there's some seriously obnoxious Dark Knight fans out there that just unfortunately has burnt me out on just hearing the words The Dark Knight just a little bit. Coming in at number 4 is by a landslide the most underrated and underappreciated film that Nolan has ever done, and that is Insomnia. In a lot of ways, this is his most straightforward film, this and Oppenheimer, and it's just a basic thriller murder mystery. You have Al Pacino, who's a little bit of a dirty cop, certainly kind of rides the line of morality a bit, and he is hunting a serial killer in Alaska who is Robin Williams. And very early on in the movie, they're chasing Robin Williams through a bunch of fog, and he shoots at somebody that he assumes is the killer, and it's actually his partner who was getting ready to flip on him to internal affairs. And so the entire movie from that point on is very much a traditional cat and mouse game between detective and killer, but the killer has something on the hero. The killer knows that the good guy is not so much of a good guy. And so you have Al Pacino trying to take down the killer while also trying to cover his tracks and kind of send everybody off in different ways. And it's just such a damn good movie. It is such a good thriller. It's one of my favorites as far as this subgenre goes. And it's unique because this is not a completely original concept from Nolan. This is actually a remake, and I don't even think he wrote the script. And so this is the only time where he was quite literally director for hire, and yet he just elevates the material so much with all of the little tricks that he usually does, with it being much more straightforward. And I think Al Pacino is brilliant in it. I think it was maybe the best villainous performance that we ever got out of Robin Williams, because there was about 3 or 4 there, and he's just so damn good in that. I adore this movie, and part of it being that it's so underappreciated and so many people have never heard of it, never seen it, or they just automatically put it at the bottom because it's not a wild concept. It always makes me appreciate it so much more and want to champion it that much more. Number 3 is going to be Batman Begins. This is my favorite, obviously, of the Dark Knight trilogy. Now, there was a time when I liked the Dark Knight more, but over time I have grown to really appreciate how much of an achievement this film was. At a time where comic book films were, not necessarily dead, but we're still kind of rising out of the ashes. You had Batman films in general that were just beyond dead, just zombified. Nobody wanted to touch Batman after Batman and Robin. And you have Christopher Nolan that comes in that delivers one of those comic book films along with Spider-Man, along with the original X-Men and Blade, that absolutely kicked off this new generation for comic book films that has now led to them being the most successful and the biggest films that come out every single year, except for this year. But you have Batman Begins that is 100% a Batman story. It's one of the best, if not the best, origin story comic book film in my mind. I love the villain here in Ra's al Ghul, and I love the way that it's not quite revealed what the central villain is going to be until the end of the film. You get these supplementary villains as well with Falcone, and you have Cillian Murphy showing up as Scarecrow. All of the different side characters you get introduced to with the new Alfred, and you have Julius Fox. Julius Fox?
English, motherfucker, do you speak it?
Okay, I googled it, Lucius Fox. I knew it didn't sound right. I wasn't going to wait for the comment sections for that one. So the new Lucius Fox with Morgan Freeman, the new Gordon, and all these different characters that we have known previous versions, and this, for the most part, in the Nolan trilogy are the best versions of them. I love the color palette here too. To me, this is the best look that Gotham had. After that, like Dark Knight Rises, where they had the more like Chicago look, it just always was a bit too cleaned up for me. I like kind of the seedy noir vibe that this movie had. I love the bat suit as well. I know they had to alter it for the neck movement and shit, but to me, this is the best that the Bale Batman ever looked. There's not too many flaws that I have with Batman Begins, to be honest with you. Like, to me, this is about as perfect as a comic book film can get, especially with having some of those Nolanisms in there where it's being told out of order, and he certainly elevates the material beyond what a traditional origin story was ever known to be. So, over time, I've grown to appreciate this movie as the best of the Nolan trilogy. And this is absolutely one of those situations where if you ask me tomorrow, they might flip. If I could give them both number 1 and tie them, I would. But for right now, my number 2 is The Prestige. Absolutely one of my favorite films of all time. And it's a movie that I walked into basically blind, which might be one of the reasons why I was so blown away by it. I knew nothing about the story of this. I knew magic had to do with it, but all I really saw that sold me on it was Christian Bale and Hugh Jackman. Batman and Wolverine. That's why I went to go see it. And I think this is one of the more brilliant stories that Christopher Nolan has told, because every single time that I watch it, I find a new layer there that makes it so much more impactful. And the movie is basically laid out like a magic trick, the 3 parts of a magic trick. And I love the way that the whole theme of revenge and hatred and just this vendetta that these two characters have comes to full fruition by the end of it in some very horrifying ways. And when you get to the end of it and some of the twists are revealed, there are some of those brilliant twists that are so in front of your face and are so simple and basic that you almost feel stupid for not having figured it out by then. But just like Hugh Jackman's character, whenever things are suggested to him, and he's like, it's gotta be something besides that. That's too easy. And you as an audience member go along that same path. Again, at the risk of being redundant, you get an awesome cast here and everybody brings their A game, and you have two of the most celebrated actors, especially at the time, going head to head. And it's one of those times where neither character is really likable. There's not really a whole lot of good qualities about them, and the more that their feud goes on, the more you as a rational person kind of start to despise them to a certain degree and just pity how ridiculous they're being. But because they're such powerhouse actors, they never lose me. I'm still engaged in their journey. I'm still engaged to see one or both of them find the error of their ways, or to have some kind of an awakening and be like, this is all stupid. Something. I'm always engaged with the characters. And I just think that it's one of the more tightly written movies by Christopher Nolan. Sometimes his concepts, his twists, his intending to pull the rug out from under you can kind of get in his way sometimes. I think this is one of those times where he nailed it perfectly. Such a dark, fucked up ending that the more you think about it, the more you kind of peel back the layers, the more that all of it was set up throughout the film, and the execution does nothing but just reinforces all of the themes of the story. But my favorite Christopher Nolan film, process of elimination, has already probably revealed it to you. It's Inception. And this is one of those movies that I loved from the very first time that I saw it. I went with a bunch of like film students that I was hanging out with when I was like in my early 20s, and so we got to see it a couple of nights early, and I came out of it raving. As soon as it was opened wide, I took another one of my friends to go see it, bought it, rewatched it as soon as it was on Blu-ray. I've rewatched it probably the most times than any of these movies, pretty close with Batman Begins. But it's one of those times like The Prestige where these huge concepts, these wild, mind-bending, just twisty concepts to me come together in a perfect way. I know some people don't agree. Some people think it's just a bunch of pretentious bullshit. Respectfully disagree. It absolutely works for me. I think all the rules are laid out in a way where it's very smartly done and smartly crafted, but at the same time, it's accessible enough to where most people, at least within 2 watches, can grasp pretty much everything that's going on. Another stacked cast. You got Leo DiCaprio here as the main character, trying to get back to his family, and a very, again, emotional journey for the character, like the payoff by the end of it. Christopher Nolan can make an emotional story and emotional characters most of the time. And you get a side characters that this is a heist film at its heart when you strip away all the Nolan concepts, and they make one of the more memorable like heist crews here. The action is filmed and executed so viscerally to where the energy of the movie is always at a breakneck pace. There is always this brewing tension. The deeper they go into the dream and the more danger that they are in, and the more that certain rules are revealed to you, like, oh, this dude's shot. Oh yeah, but we're being medicated, so if he dies here, he goes into limbo and he's fucked forever. Great! Could have known that before we went into this dream. There's so many cool things in the third act that are just such great payoffs for all the characters, and even just the subject of the heist and Cillian Murphy's character is very emotional, and him kind of getting this fake, albeit fake, reassurance from his father to kind of build his own empire. And man, the score, which I have not mentioned once, and Christopher Nolan has some magnificent scores in his movies. The score here, especially the piece Time that is in the third act whenever Leo DiCaprio finally is able to go home, might be my favorite score of all time. Like, it's one that genuinely gives me goosebumps every time that I watch it. So this is, to me, a perfect film. It's also one where, strangely to me, even to this day, people debate the ending, and to me the ending is a very simple, straightforward message for the audience to pick up, and people just get bogged down on the wrong details. Check out my review if you want to have me just explain the ending and how I view the ending anyway. But this is a movie that is just eternally rewatchable to me, and the best example of Christopher Nolan's strengths as a filmmaker. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed that ranking, please click over here for all of my 2023 new release reviews, and I'm also going to put my playlist of all of the Christopher Nolan reviews. I've reviewed every one of his films. Please like, share, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss everything in the future, and as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.